Welcome to Thomas Baumgärtler's and my presentation of our research paper. My name is Philipp Oedel. Thomas and me, we are both professors for economics at the business department of the Offenburg University. The title of our paper is Fighting Fraud and Corruption in European Structural and Investment Funds, a qualitative analysis for Germany. The presentation is structured as follows. First, we present the object of the investigation, followed by the anti-corruption measures and strategies of the European Union. Then we analyze fraud offenses in EU member states, followed by the national anti-fraud strategies from the point of view of Germany. We finish with a short conclusion and an outlook. So let's start with the object of the investigation. The reason for this research project is that corruption and fraud have become more present issues in politics and the public sphere in recent years. This raises the questions of what relevance the fight against corruption has, what measures are taken by the European Union, including Germany, to prevent corruption as well as to detect it, and above all, whether these measures are ultimately sufficient at all. This paper aims to examine what Germany can learn from other countries and where Germany can perhaps serve as a model for other countries. The European funds to be examined are the European Regional Development Fund, the European Social Fund, the Cohesion Fund, European Agricultural Fund for the Rural Development, and the European Maritime and Fishery Fund. But actually, how is corruption generally to be measured? The next page. In addition to qualitative approaches such as individual surveys or observations, the quantitative measurability of corruption has existed since the 1990s. Probably the best known is the Corruption Perception Index, CPI, which is compiled and published annually by the International Secretary of Transparency International. The quantitative measurement methods are criminal statistics, perceptual indices, and victim indices with different advantages and disadvantages you can see on this page. So the anti-corruption measures and the strategies of the European Union on the next page are presented as follows. At first, the legal regulations on anti-corruption in the European Union and then in Germany, and after all, anti-fraud strategy of the European Union. The European Union, since the 1990s, standards have been developed at the international level for both preventing and fighting corruption. For European countries, the following anti-corruption regimes are the European Union itself, the Council of Europe, the OECD, and the United Nations are of paramount importance. In Germany, in 2003, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption was adopted. The UNCAC was signed by Germany in 2003 and ratified in November 2014. By ratifying, Germany committed itself to prevent corruption and to prosecute it. The European anti-fraud strategy, according to the Article 317 and Article 36 of the Financial Regulation, require the Commission to manage the EU budget in accordance with the principles of sound financial management, and thus to carry out international controls. This includes prevention, detection, correction, and follow-up in case of fraud as well as other irregularities. Now Thomas continues with the analysis of fraud offenses in the EU member states.
Well, thank you, Philip. May I also extend a warm welcome to you all. In the following slides, I would like to present more results of our qualitative analysis. I will focus on the EU member states through our research question, look in particular at Germany. Let us first start with a general delimitation of irregularities, as we will still need this delimitation in the course of the analysis. The concept of irregularities includes both intentional and non-intentional acts that can be committed by economy operators. Irregularity committed intentionally, this is deliberately, is considered fraud and is defined in the present context as an irregularity reported as fraudulent. This is to be distinguished from irregularities not reported as fraudulent. This is actions or transactions which, also not in conformity with applicable EU law, are mostly the result of erroneous actions that occurred unintentionally in the process of applying for, granting, or making available fund resources, and can also lead to considerable financial damage. Member states are required to report fraudulent and non-fraudulent irregularities above a threshold of 10,000 euros. Various factors can be considered for both fraudulent and non-fraudulent irregularities. The European Commission lists 12 main categories, which are further subdivided into subcategories. Causes of irregularities are, for example, fails or falsified request, fails identity of the beneficiary, incomplete or falsified document, but also artificially created framework conditions for obtaining financial resources. Due to time constraints, I cannot go into the details, but you can see the list here as well as typical examples of irregularities. Here you can see the other categories and examples of irregularities from non-action to other causes. In order to identify and combat fraud risk, member states need effective risk systems. Each member state is required to take anti-fraud measures under the Article 125 4C for the EU directive. The European Commission offers the member states 2 risk systems to manage and combat their risks in EU fronts. It is the Arachne risk scoring tool and the self-assessment tool. I will now briefly describe both tools. The administrative authorities, therefore, need systems to detect fraudulent behavior. Above all, this includes analytical procedures that detect anomalies. Arachne is such a tool for extracting data, especially company data. It is a risk assessment tool that can increase the efficiency of project selection, administrative reviews, and audits, and improve fraud investigation, prevention, and detection. The tool is particularly suitable for identifying and assessing fraud risk in the area of European structural and investment funds, such as public procurement. Arachne captures 7 main categories of risk and further subdivided them into 102 individual risks. The European Commission recommends that all member states of the Union use Arachne for risk management. In this slide, you could see, for example, the concentration with 13 individual risk. For example, beneficiaries involved in multiple projects or contractors involved in multiple projects, just for example. So the problem is Arachne does not comply with German law. For reasons of data protection and company-related data, the tool is not used in Germany. This information was also confirmed to us in interviews with responsible persons from the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs and the Federal Ministry of Finance. In comparison between countries shows here on this slide 20 that Arachne is used very differently. You can see here the distribution of the number of operational programs from 2014 to 20, for which Arachne is used in each member state as a share of the total number of operational programs of that member state for the period 2014 to 20. Arachne is now being used more in the Czech Republic, Italy, Luxembourg, Slovenia, Portugal, and Bulgaria. It is not used in 7 EU member states, including Germany. These are findings for the year 2019. Let's move on to the second tool, the European Commission's self-assessment tool. Germany is taking its own approach to risk management. In the anti-fraud strategy, the responsible federal ESF managing authorities use the self-assessment tool in the management and control system based on Microsoft Excel. The tool is currently used in Germany for the operational program ESF Federal 2014 to 20. The tool is used for self-assessment of the risk of fraud, and the self-assessment team is formed that includes specialists from responsible federal ministries and administrative authorities. The aim is to achieve the most comprehensive, networked, and effective approach possible in the assessment of fraud risk. Using the self-assessment tool means, on the one hand, identifying and assessing the program-specific fraud and corruption risk, and on the other hand, describing and assessing the measures and precautions taken to combat fraud and corruption. The risk description and assessment with the associated countermeasures are divided into 5 risk areas in the tool, which you can see on this slide below. It is the expression of interest and application procedure, the implementation and record keeping at the beneficiary, also specific risk in the implementation of financial instruments, then the certifications and payments, and at least the procurement and contracting. The analysis of the funds selected below is based on the importance of the allocation of EU funds to the Federal Republic of Germany. According to this, Germany primarily receives financial resources from funds to the Common Agriculture Policy and Fisheries at the state level from the Regional Development Fund, and at the federal level from the Fund to labor market and social policy measures. In the following, these funds are analyzed sector and country specifically with regard to identified irregularities with a special focus on Germany. The following analysis focuses exclusively on fraudulent irregularities in the program period 2014 to 20 in the selected EU funds, and also addresses different categories of irregularities. So the main focus is here the fraudulent irregularities, not the fraudulent irregularities. So I follow with the slide 23. Let us first look at the fraud offenses in the area of the Common Agricultural Policy. For short, CAP. CAP is financed by 2 EU funds, the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development and the Agriculture Guarantee Fund. CAP includes expenditure for support for agriculture and support for or to rural development. Rural development is financed by EUMODFRAUD, which is included in the European Structural and Investment Funds and is therefore analyzed in more detail. First country comparison on irregularities reported as fraudulent in the agriculture sector is shown in this figure. The detected fraud cases with a low volume of more than 1 million euro are concentrated in a few countries, namely Romania, the Czech Republic, Italy, Denmark, and Spain. Germany, with a total of 9 reported cases, an amount of 760,000 euros is about average for the EU. Various factors can be held responsible for the concentration of fraud cases in a few states. The probability of success in detecting fraud is likely to depend, among other things, on the effectiveness and thus the quality of the country's specific fraud and detection instruments. This also raises the questions of the extent to which the toolbox has been applied and fraud prevention measures have been consistently introduced. In the member states, the criminal law application necessary to protect the EU budget also varies, which could further explain the difference between EU countries. An important indicator in the field of fraud evaluation is the so-called fraud detection rate, for FDR for short. The ratio is determined according to the following equation: total final financial amount affected by suspected and established fraud in relation to the total expenditure. Let us now look at the fraud cases specifically in the field of rural development in individual EU member states. This graph compares FDR in the Common Agricultural Policy and in rural development in the period 2015 to 19. CAP is the blue pillar, RD is the orange pillar. On the one hand, it shows that FDR is rural development is consistently higher than for CAP in its entirety. Countries with a high above average FDR in CAP and RD alike are Romania, Lithuania, Estonia, Bulgaria, Denmark, Hungary, Slovakia, Portugal, and Poland. This finding correlates highly with the values from CPI, the Corruption Perception Index, with the exception of Denmark and RD. There are only 9 cases, but this results is in a high involved amount. Germany is clearly below the EU average with 9 cases in CAP and 16 detected cases in RD. Let's take a brief look at the other funds. The Cohesion Fund, the ERDF and the ESF. Both the number and the financial amount involved in irregularities reported as fraudulent are highest for ERDF. In terms of the financial amounts, CF accounts for around 20% of irregularities. In terms of the number of fraudulent irregularities, ESF accounts for around a quarter of cases. Let's look again at FDR, the fraud detection rate. Across all funds, the ESE funds, Slovakia provides a significant deviation, as Slovakia reports an FDR of about 23%, which means that almost a quarter of the expenditure received is classified as fraudulent irregularities. This is a really very high proportion. However, this is due to only 3 cases, which generate a loss volume of 850 million euros Slovakia is thus a significant outlier. Deviating from this, but still with high FDR values, are Latvia and Denmark, followed by Greece, France, and Hungary. It is astonished that Denmark, which is generally little affected by fraud and corruption, has a significantly high value of 0.39%. The category of countries which with a really low FDR below 0.05 to 0.02% also includes Germany, which with 0.04%, which suggests that the existing measures to combat fraud and corruption are having an effect. Finally, member states with an FDR of 0%, for example, Belgium, Cyprus, or Spain, are supposedly without fraud. However, the criticism of the European Court of Auditors is likely to apply here as well, by which administrative authorities of the member states examined by the court make no or only insufficient reports on cases of fraud or suspected fraud. If we look further only at the fraud detection rates for ERDF in particular, the databases at country level becomes narrower. Of 28 possible EU states, only 70 countries reported their specific FDR in 2019, as you can see here on in this chart. The EU 28 average FDR is a relatively low one with 0.18%, with Latvia, Hungary, France, Romania, Denmark, Greece, and Poland above. Below average values are recorded by 10 countries, which can demonstrate a positive fraud detection rate, including Germany, with a very low value of only 0.03%. Here too, it seems reasonable to assume that Germany successfully prevents or detects fraud and corruption at an early stage with the established management and control system in the ERDF operational programs. This is also confirmed, for example, by the risk management report of the federal state of Bremen in the ERDF Bremen operational program. Bremen is a state and a state in Germany, prepared in 2019, which highlights Germany's positive performance with regard to the prevention and punishment of legal violations in cases of fraud and corruption. Comparable confirming statements are also made by other states participating in the operational programs. So finally, in this chart, we look at FDR in the ESF program. First of all, in the area of ESF, it is striking to find countries with relatively high FDRs, which are otherwise considered less susceptible to fraud as measured by the CPI for 2019, including Austria, Sweden, and the UK, and the Netherlands, but also Germany. With an FDR of 0.04, Germany still has an acceptable value, but this is only slightly below the EU average of 0.06%. Even Finland, which is considered to be low in fraud and corruption, still has a value of 0.02%. One reason for this could be that countries with a higher GDP also benefit from EU spending from the ESF and may also cause higher loss volumes in fraud detected. Typically, on the other hand, the data from the Czech Republic, Portugal, and Bulgaria, which each report FDR values of 0%. This finding does not correlate it with the consistently high CPI values in these countries and suggests that potential fraud and corruption cases may not be detected in the ESF or are not or only incompletely entered into IMS for administrative reasons. The IMS is the Irregularity Management System of the European Commission. As with the previously analyzed SE funds, the reasons for the significant differences at country level remain hidden in the case of ESF, and no firm statements can be made due to the lack of background information. With its descriptive methodology and the existing data gaps, the analysis only provides here a rough assessment of fraud detection in individual EU member states. So, Philip, you go on.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. So the shivers that Thomas showed raise the question, are there special structural features in Germany? So in which dimensions is Germany probably a special case? Germany has a successful record of fraud detection, is one of the countries with a low fraud detection rate, and is also well below the EU average at the funds analyzed. Two questions arise. Are the audits in Germany sufficient at all? And if yes, what are the special features in Germany that make it a country with a low level of fraud and corruption? So we have a look on the national anti-fraud strategies from the point of view of Germany. The main focus lays on the operational program ESF Federal Germany. Evaluation of the interviews with the ministries and managing authorities involved. Interviews were held with the Federal Ministry of Finance and the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. Together, further evidence on fraud prevention in the ESF from the perspective of a German federal ministry and managing authority. What are the agencies involved in the program? For each operational program, OP, the national authority shall appoint the following institution: a managing authority, a certifying authority, and an audit authority. Concerning the testing system in Germany, important criteria to detect special structural features are the institutional cooperation, the fact that Germany is a federal state, and the risk assessment tools in the operational programs used. So have a look on the institutional cooperation. The administrative authorities implement the funding programs according to the OP and pay particular attention to social financial management, so-called first level check. The certifying authority prepares the payment applications to the European Commission. It certifies that the data come from reliable accounting systems based on verifiable and audited supporting documents. The audit authority ensures that the management and control system of the OP are functioning. To this end, it audits the management and the projects on the basis of representative samples and declare expenditure. The audit authority operates independently and strictly separate from the other authorities. What are the specifica of a federal state? Within the member states of the European Union, there are 3 federalist countries: Belgium, Germany, and Austria. All 3 countries are found on the fraud prevention statistics in the group with the fewest fraud offenses. Within the operational programs of the ESI funds, the procedure for organizing and distribution of competences for federally constituted states initially means additional work and costs. If a member state, such as Germany, has a federal structure, the funding and thus the administration of the funds is handled by the federal states under their own sovereignty. Here, the administration of each federal state forms a payment agency. In this case, the EU requires, irrespective of the size of the member state, that a so-called coordinating office also be appointed. This serves as a European Commission's sole point of contact for all questions concerning administration and control. The Federal Ministry of Finance, together with the Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, acts as the coordinating body for the 16 German paying agencies. The federal government and the federal states are involved in the managing of EU funds. And due to the federal structure of the Federal Republic of Germany, both the federal government and the federal states are involved in the managing of the EU funds. This regards their respective audit offices independently perform external financial control tasks for this area. So now Thomas continues with the used tools.
Germany, the ESF operational program is implemented at a federal and state level. The following remarks primarily refer to the fight against fraud and corruption in the federal ESF programs of the operational program. It is called ESF Bund, Germany 2014 to 20. Bund means federal, the federal structure. So the management and control system established by ESF Managing Authority include different principles of action as an essential part of the fraud and corruption prevention and control strategy. As you can see, the principle of action or approaches include in particular the separation of functions, intensive checks at the level of application and implementation, principle of transparency, avoidance on conflicts of interest, training and information materials for involved staff to raise their awareness of fraud and corruption risks. In addition, the management and control system includes a risk management system which supports, accompanies, and complements the prevention of and fight against fraud and corruption. The main principle can be seen in this figure and is also described in our paper. The European Commission provides the member states with a self-assessment tool with the help of which specific fraud and corruption risk are identified and assessed. And based on this, where measures and precautions are described and assessed with which fraud and corruption are or are to be combated repressively and preventively. This tool is used in the OP ESF Federal Germany. The self-assessment tool or the self-assessment of fraud and corruption risk relates to the individual ESF federal programs. The focus here is on event-related preventive and awareness-raising aspects of fraud and corruption, in which the legal framework applicable in Germany for awareness raising is also taken into account, including measures under criminal law, subsidy law, the civil service law, and of course the labor law. With the current legislation, a comprehensive framework from combating fraud and corruption already exists in the Federal Republic of Germany. Conceptually, the current strategy for preventing and combating fraud and corruption for the operational program ESF Federal Germany is based on the application of the self-assessment tool in order to successfully apply the tool in the ESF, the following general procedural steps are required. First of all, you have to constitute a self-assessment team. This means it's a team with specialists, different point of views. Also the checking whether the risk categories specified in the self-assessment tool are suitable for especially the OP ESF Federal Germany from 2014 to 20. Also the adaptation, the supplementation and the evaluation of the risk areas, the derivation, presentation and evaluation of the countermeasures to be defined, and of course the review and update at regular intervals. This is a really important point. So yeah, I see it's a little bit difficult to see, but I wanted to put in one slide here the evaluation scheme, which has its origins in the European Commission and has been implemented by the OP ESF Federal, is shown in this figure. And the self-assessment team first identifies the possible risk, then the names and assess them in terms of their probability of occurrence and their degree of impact. This means this is the gross risk. Furthermore, the countermeasures are named and likely-wise assessed with regard to their probability of occurrence and their degree of impact on the gross risk. A remaining net risk is then compared with the tolerable target risk. If there is a significant deviation between the target and the net risk, additionally, measures must be developed and integrated into the risk assessment system so that the tolerable residual risk can be achieved. It's also described in our paper, and because of the time constraints, I keep short here. So the next slide, the risk assessment in the self-assessment tool is a dynamic process because new findings both on real and suspected fraud cases which have occurred, as well as from audit reports from the audit authority and audit bodies, require the ESF assessment team to regularly revise the risk areas. In particular, the weaknesses discovered in practice are to be optimized by reassessing the risk and countermeasures where necessary. The review of the self-assessment usually takes place annually and is orientated towards the indicators of the following review strategy, as you can see here in this table. The general procedural steps of the obligation to report irregularities or cases of suspected fraud in the OPESF Federal can be found in the reporting system as in the following chart. First, the administrative offices of the federal ministries involved, as well as the program implementing offices of the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs, enter their reports of irregularities, including cases of fraud or suspected fraud, into the IMS tool and forward this information to the ESF certifying authority. It is in the department of the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. And also it is irrelevant whether the fraud or suspected fraud cases is below or above the threshold of the 10,000 euros. Regardless of the amount, all cases of suspected fraud must be reported immediately to the managing authority only the obligation to report to the European Commission does not apply to irregularities with amount below 10,000 euros. In the next step, the managing authority or administrative body informs the certifying authority in the Federal Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs about the irregularity or the suspected fraud. In the further notification procedure, the certifying authority examines the cases reported by the federal ministries and program implementation agencies and forwards them to the anti-fraud coordination unit, the so-called FCOS of the Federal Ministry of Finance. This ministry is responsible for protecting the financial interests of the European Union in the Federal Republic of Germany and serves as the central information point between the German authorities and the services in the European Commission, including OLAF. In a final step, the reports received by the Federal Ministry of Finance are transmitted to OLAF on a quarterly basis.
So, thanks, Thomas. We can conclude, due to the federal structure of the Federal Republic of Germany, both the federal government and the federal states are involved in the management of the EU funds. For internal control, this means that managing and certifying authorities are also established at the federal state level in each case. This means a multi-control principle in checking, which is conducive to detecting fraud and corruption with the aim of a zero-tolerance policy. In addition to this institution of internal financial control, external financial controls operate at both European and national level. Their task is to audit the budgetary and economic management in full independence, taking into account the community treaty or on the basis of the national legal provisions. Thus, the external financial control bodies are not part of the internal control framework of the community. Rather, there is a clear separation between internal and external control. The different levels of government in the collection or spending of EU budget funds are also reflected in the audit by external financial control. At the EU level, the European Court of Auditors operates as an independent body. At the level of the member state, Germany, due to the federal structure, both the Federal Court of Auditors and the Courts of Auditors of the federal states are active within the scope of their competences. And now, Thomas, with a conclusion concerning the tools. Du hast kein Mikro an.
Thanks. So outlook, the last points, and the conclusion, and a little bit outlook. So as we could see, the sectoral and regional analysis in the ESE funds in Germany has an efficient and effective set of instruments to prevent and combat fraud, as evidenced by the consistently low and thus successful fraud detection rates. However, it should be noted that the risk assessment carried out in the self-assessment tool, including the potential effects and fixed countermeasures, represent a minimum level of risk prevention, and that further risk aspects or areas could be included in the assessment system. The criticism from the European Court of Auditors is also directed at countries such as Germany, which to date have not used integrated or cross-country risk assessment tools such as Arachne as a networked IT tool, and whose whose use is also welcomed by auditors commissioned by the European Commission. So it is therefore no coincidence that for the new multi-annual financial framework to 2021 to 27, the European Court of Auditors calls on legislative bodies to provide appropriated data analysis and data mining tools in the context of fraud prevention and control, or to further develop existing systems. The latter refers to Arachne, the application of which is considered by administrative authorities of individual member states to be in need of improvement. With regard to Germany, in addition to this argument, it will no longer be possible to maintain the appeal to data protection of company-related key figures in order not to have to use Arachne or other IT tools. In future, it will also be indispensable for the prevention and combating of fraud in Germany's OPs to establish Arachne or a comparable tool which offers the potential to record fraud risk at member state level in an integrated, systematic, and cost-efficient manner. Thank you very much for your interest and your attention.
Including the environmental disclosure, the social disclosure, but not on the disclosure on corruption. And this is exactly where we position our paper. Another specific stream of the literature analyzes the determinants of CSR disclosure in banking. These studies have been a very important point of reference for our analysis because they allowed us to identify the most important variables that influence the corporate social responsibility disclosure in banking, and consequently also corruption-related disclosure, which can be considered a subgroup of CSR disclosure. There are numerous theoretical frameworks that are adopted in the empirical literature, and we show them in these slides. They are the following: so the agency theory, the impression management theory, and so forth. But in our specific research setting, we focus on two main theoretical frameworks, namely the legitimacy theory proposed by Suckman in 1995 and the signaling theory proposed by Spence in 1973. According to the legitimacy theory, banks are bound into a social contracts and they should provide socially desirable goods to the society. And if the society thinks that firms or banks do not do so, they have to restore their institutional legitimacy, and they can do that also by means of disclosure. The signaling theory offers a different perspective. According to this theory, in general, firms that are characterized by high levels of performance are willing to differentiate themselves from low-performing firms. This theory has been applied in general to financial performance, but it can be applied also to other kinds of performance or effectiveness. For instance, it can be applied also with reference to the effectiveness of anti-corruption mechanisms at firm-specific level. So we rely on these two theories to develop our theoretical background and our research hypothesis. With specific reference to the legitimacy theory within the context of our research, this theory posits that after the occurrence of a corruption scandals, banks that were involved in such kind of problems should be willing to restore their institutional legitimacy, and they can do that by means of disclosure. And therefore, we develop our first research hypothesis as follows. banks that have been involved in corruption problems exhibit higher levels of corruption-related disclosure after the occurrence of the corruption scandal in order to restore their legitimacy. In contrast, the signaling theory offers a different perspective. So, with specific reference to our research setting, according to this theory, after the occurrence of corruption events, banks that were not involved in these kinds of problems should be willing to differentiate themselves by providing disclosure about the reliability of their anti-corruption mechanisms. And therefore, according to this theory, we develop our second research hypothesis as follows. Banks that have not been involved in corruption problems exhibit higher levels of corruption-related disclosure compared to those banks that experience corruption issues. So we can notice that these two theories are in stark contrast with each other, and our empirical setting allows us to understand which of these two theories is the most relevant one to explain the relationship between corruption events and corruption-related disclosure. So by performing this empirical analysis, the contribution we provide to the literature is manifold. So first of all, we provide evidence on the different corruption-related disclosure by banks that were involved in corruption cases and banks that were not involved in these types of scandals. In order to do that, we rely mostly on the signaling theory to explain that banks not involved in corruption cases disclose more than banks that have been involved in such cases, because as we shall see, our results are more in line with the signaling theory rather than with the legitimacy theory. We use an international sample of banks from the so-called gypsy countries, examined during the 2011-2019 period, and we demonstrate that the relationship between corruption and disclosure is also not homogeneous across countries and years, and in particular, it is affected by the quality of institutions and regulations in each country. Broadly speaking, our empirical methodology is based on a mixed panel data regression. And by means of this empirical methodology, we analyze an international bank datasets consisting of 88 banks located in the 5 gypsy countries. Our research setting also allows us to control for country-level characteristics, potential reverse causality, and endogeneity concerns. And we also take into account the influence of bank-level characteristics, institutional and regulatory country-level factors, and corporate governance mechanisms. In this slide, we show our econometric regression in the top part of the slide. So starting from the dependent variable DIJT, it is a disclosure index, and we created it by drawing upon the content analysis methodological framework proposed by Krippendorf in 2004. More specifically, we created a disclosure dictionary, which is specifically tailored to analyze corruption-related disclosure in bank annual financial reports. We created this dictionary by selecting the most relevant words to test our research hypothesis by drawing upon a selection of sources. And this dictionary has also been subsequently validated by a panel of experts. So the results of this procedure is a list of 88 words, and we aggregate the occurrence of these words in the financial reports of the banks by means of the formula that we show in the lowest part of these slides. So DIJT, the disclosure index, is equal to the summation of the number of occurrences of the words of the dictionary in the annual reports divided by the total numbers of words of the report. So going back to the econometric regression in the top part of the slide, we regress our disclosure index DIJT over DIJ 2011, which is the initial level of disclosure at the beginning of our sampling period in 2011, corrupt, which is a dummy variable that identifies banks that were involved in corruption scandals and banks that were not involved. And we also introduced bank-level controls, country, and year fixed effects. Just to give you an idea about our disclosure dictionary, In this slide, we report the whole dictionary, which consists of 88 words, and they include the most important terms such as corruption, misconduct, misbehavior, and so forth. As already mentioned, we selected these words from a comprehensive set of sources that include the glossary of corruption-related terms provided by the EU4 Anti-Corruption Resource Center, the standard 2005 205 on anti-corruption by the Global Reporting Initiatives, the glossary of corruption-related terms provided by Corruption Watch, the so-called corruptionary, so the dictionary of corruption terms provided by Transparency International, and other sources. And as already mentioned, this dictionary has been validated by a panel of experts in banking, corporate social responsibility, and disclosure. In our empirical analysis, we analyzed the effects of two different dummy variables. The first one, as already mentioned, is corrupt, which is a dummy variable equal to 1 for those banks that experienced corruption problems and 0 otherwise. Therefore, this dummy variable allows us to differentiate between banks that were involved in corruption scandals, what we call corrupted banks, from banks that were not involved in corruption scandals, so banks that we call uncorrupted banks. The second indicator variable is corrupt after, which is equal to 1 for corrupted banks, but after the corruption scandal becomes public. And so this dummy variable allows us to examine the effect of the spread of the news of the corruption scandals on the disclosure on, about corruption. As already mentioned, we also introduce a comprehensive set of bank level controls lagged by 1 period, and they are the logarithm of total assets, the cost to income ratio, the level of capitalization, and so forth. And we also include sigma j and delta t, which are respectively country and year fixed effects. Let me describe briefly the sample selection approach that we adopted. So we needed to identify banks that were involved in corruption scandals and banks that were not involved in this kind of problems. So in order to identify the banks that were involved in corruption scandals, we searched for corruption scandals news in the most reputable news publication websites, including the Financial Times, Il Sole 24 Ore, Expansión, and others. Unfortunately, it was not always easy to understand whether a certain scandal could be considered a corruption scandal. And so in order to be consistent, we adopt a very clear definition of corruption, and we selected all cases that fall under this exact definition. And in particular, we follow the definition proposed by Pellegrini in 2011. And I won't read the whole definition, but basically corruption is defined as the misuse of entrusted power for private gain. And it includes various types of behavior, such as bribery, misappropriation, and others. So we, by means of this approach, we were able to find a group of 22 banks that were involved in corruption problems. But we still needed to identify a sort of control group of banks that were not involved in corruption problems. So in order to do that, we rely on the literature on CSR disclosure in banking that identifies 3 main determinants of the disclosure on corporate social responsibility, and therefore also on corruption, the disclosure on corruption. The most important variables are size, profitability, and the amount of deposits. So we use these variables as matching criteria to identify a sample of uncorrupted banks. And in particular, we selected for each corrupted bank from a certain country A, we selected the closest bank, uncorrupted bank with the closest level of size, the one with the closest level of profitability, and the one with the closer level of amount of deposits. And so in doing that, we selected a control group of banks that were not involved in corruption scandal, and they are in total 66 uncorrupted banks. As already mentioned, we focused on the so-called gypsy countries, and they are the following: Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland. We decided to focus on these countries because they share important characteristics, and in particular, they represent the most troubled economies of the Eurozone during the last decade, and overall, they are characterized by higher levels of perceived corruption, according to the Corruption Perception Index proposed by Transparency International in 2019. And so, to sum up, we selected a sample of comparable banks that did not experience any corruption issues and compared it with the disclosure of corrupted banks. We selected the banks from the same countries that have the closest levels of size, profitability, and amount of deposits. However, for those countries that have a limited number of banks, such as Greece and Ireland, we needed to slightly adjust these methodologies because it was not always possible to find a comparable uncorrupted banks for each corrupted bank. And so in this case, we selected other banks, other comparable banks from the other gypsy countries. And so our final sample consists of a treatment group of 22 corrupted banks and a control group of 66 uncorrupted banks. So in total, we have 88 banks from the gypsy countries analyzed over the 2011-2019 period. In this slide, we show the baseline results of our empirical analysis. In this table, we show the results where the corruption dummy is equal to the corrupt dummy. So where we differentiate between banks that were involved in corruption scandals and banks that were not involved. In the first row of this table, we can notice that the corrupt dummy enters the regression with negative coefficients and negative and statistically significant coefficient. So this result shows that banks that were not involved in corruption scandals provide more corruption-related disclosure compared to banks that were involved in corruption problems. So this result is in line with the signaling theory because it emerges that uncorrupted banks are willing to differentiate themselves from corrupted banks. The results are similar also when we use the corrupt after dummy as the corruption dummy. And so where this variable, as already mentioned, allows us to assess the impact of the spread of the news of the corruption scandal. And also in this case, the results of this dummy variable is negative and statistically significant at conventional levels. And so also this result is in line with the signaling theory in that after the occurrence of corruption scandals, uncorrupted banks are even more willing to differentiate themselves from corrupted banks, also in order to show the reliability of their anti-corruption mechanism. And they do that by means of disclosure. We also performed various additional analyses. And in particular, we try to understand whether different country level characteristics influence the relationship between corruption events and corruption related disclosures. In order to do that, we introduced in our regression model four additional variables that takes into account the following aspects. So the control of corruption, the perception of the corruption, the legal restrictions on non-traditional bank activities, and the legal restrictions on bank ownership and control of non-financial firms. So in this table, we show the results of our baseline model where we added these four additional variables. So the first result is that our results hold. So the corruption dummy is still negative and statistically significant at 5% level. And the other interesting result is that 3 out of 4 of our additional variables enter the regression with a statistically significant coefficient. And in particular, it emerges that the level of disclosure is higher for the countries that have higher levels of control of corruption, whilst it is lower for countries that have higher restrictions on non-traditional banking activities and restrictions on the ownership and control of non-financial firms. In another analysis, we also introduced the interaction between our corruption dummy and the four aforementioned country-level variables that take into control the control of corruption and the restrictions. And so, once again, our results are still there. They are still negative and statistically significant. And once again, for 3 out of 4 interaction dummies, they enter the regression with statistically significant coefficients. And so this result remarks once again the importance of country-level characteristics that play an important role in shaping the disclosure practices related to corruption of the banks. Our results stand up well to a comprehensive battery of robustness tests. And in particular, we control for the initial level of disclosure in order to address potential endogeneity concerns. We also run a 2-stage Ekman regression. We control for internal corporate governance mechanisms because the excellent literature has shown that corporate governance mechanisms play an important role in influencing the disclosure of banks. We also perform a placebo test where we assign randomly corruption events to our sample in order to test whether our results were driven by chance. We also excluded Italian banks because they represent approximately 50% of our sample. And we take into account also the effects of the EBA regulatory intervention, which in 2014 published some guidelines in order to enhance the consistency of the disclosure of banks at European level. So all these results hold, and they support all these robustness tests support the reliability of our results. And in this slide, we show three of them. So in the first column, we run the placebo test, and we can notice that after the placebo experiments, the corruption dummy is not statistically significant. And so these results support the idea that our results are not driven by chance, but they are related to the fact of being or not being corrupted. In the second column, we exclude Italian banks because they represent the majority of our sample, and the results are still there. The corruption dummy enters with a negative and statistically significant sign. And so it means that our baseline results are not exclusively driven by Italian banks. And in the last column, we introduced the interaction between the EBA dummy, which is equal after the publication period of these guidelines in December 2014. These guidelines published by the EBA, and the corruption dummy. It emerges that the result hold. It is the corruption dummy is still negative and statistically significant. And in addition, we do not find any significant coefficient for the interaction between the corruption dummy and the EBA dummy. Now, let me jump to the conclusions. In this paper, we carry out an analysis to understand whether and to what extent banks that were involved in corruption cases disclose more on corruption-related topics in their annual financial reports. In order to do that, we analyzed a dataset composed of 88 corrupted and uncorrupted banks from the so-called GIPSY countries. And these data are examined during the 2011-2019 time horizon. Our main finding is that uncorrupted banks disclose more than banks that were involved in corruption cases during the considered period of time. And these results are mainly in line with the signaling theory. And lastly, our empirical analysis allows us also to understand that uncorrupted banks tend to disclose more in countries characterized by higher levels of control of corruption, and in banking sector with lower restrictions on non-traditional banking activities. And so this result remark the importance of country-level characteristics and the regulation at country level to influence the behavior in terms of corruption-related disclosure in the banking industry. That's it, and thank you very much for attending this presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I manage.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, Salvatore. Thank you very much for your work, Nuria, Enzo, and Pablo. Okay, again, it's a very complete work for an important sector, particularly for the South European countries, including Ireland, also West European countries, and specifically for this complicated years for this sector, due to the last recent financial crisis and even for these new years. I don't know if we have some questions or not. Okay, perhaps not necessary. For me, there is one point that more or less you have measured or you have included the scandal. The scandal, I think, with this corruption dummy after the scandal is now for public in general due to the news, and you obtain the similar results. So I don't know if we understand well. Is there really a scandal effect that more influence of this news for bank?
Well, it emerges that from our results, it emerges that after the occurrence of corruption scandals, banks that were not involved in these scandals are even more willing to provide more information about corruption. So according to the legitimacy theory, what we would have expected is that after the occurrence of corruption scandal, corrupted banks should disclose more, but it is not the case. At least in our results, it emerges that uncorrupted banks are even more willing to provide more information. So there is corruption scandal effect, but only on uncorrupted or mainly on uncorrupted banks.
Okay. So could we return the gap of information, of the gap of disclosure amount or between one group and the other group of banks? Okay,
yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Just one comment. So the basic idea, Salvatore has already explained it perfectly, but the first dummy variable is that just simply identify which banks are corrupted, which ones are not corrupted. And the second one aims at giving, let's say, a second chance to the legitimacy theory to be corroborated. And the idea was precisely that one, just to give, let's say, corrupted banks a new opportunity to, let's say, legitimate themselves with once the news became public. So I think that in this point, our results are very robust because it's not only a matter of distinguishing between corrupted and uncorrupted banks, but also a matter of, okay, now that the public knows that you were a corrupted bank, how do you react? And the thing is that corrupted banks seems not to react in this sense, or at least not so well as uncorrupted banks.
Okay. Thank you very much. Probably for a future, the consequence in Spain, in many cases, is that uncorrupted banks, okay, due to the influence of the authorities, to to merge and to buy to acquire the corrupted banks. Could be the case of Spanish with La Caixa and Bankia and other banks.
Oscar, and hello everybody. And I think we already knew each other, but I'm a PhD student in the last moments of this period, and I'm studying at the University of Valladolid, and I'm going to present. Let's see if I can share my screen. Our research about European funds. So let's go. This is the paper about disclosure and government efficiency in European funds, which has been co-authored by Florencio López de Silanes, David Blanco Alcántara, and myself. So let's start saying that nowadays the study of European funds seems quite interesting for everyone. And we can see different news related to funds allocated by European Union in order to mitigate COVID pandemic consequences. And for example, in Spain, press is showing concerns about governance and transparency issues. And moreover, on August 2018, the European Union simplified the financial regulation applied to those receiving and managing funds. One of the main goals of these changes is the greater transparency. In addition, European Commission affirms at its website that fraud affects approximately 0.2% of the total European Union budget. On the other hand, European Commission, in the 7th report on economic, social, and territorial cohesion, highlights the main role of the quality of governance for the convergence of economic growth. Therefore, both the increasing interest on transparency and the corruption problems and the relevance of good governance in order to foster economic growth lead us to the analysis of European funds through a governance perspective. Structural investment funds were designed with the objective of convergence between members. Its aim is to strengthen their economic, social, and territorial cohesion. European funds are abundant and allow the development of multiple initiatives and projects in favor of broad sectors of society. I'd like to briefly present the 5 funds. The European Regional Development Fund focuses its investments on innovation and research and support for small and medium-sized enterprises. The Cohesion Fund finances transport and environment projects in countries with a relatively low GDP. The Agricultural Fund for Rural Development focuses on resolving the particular challenges facing rural areas. The European Maritime and Fisheries Fund helps fishermen to adopt sustainable fishing practices and to diversify their economies. And finally, the Social Fund supports employment-related projects. It includes an extra amount for the Youth Employment Initiative. Lito 2 has analyzed the relationship between these funds and economic growth of the countries measured through their GDP mainly. And authors agree in the convenience of these funds, while also find paths for improving efficacy, such as diversity through more local tailored investment. Regarding corruption, it is considered by many authors as one of the main problems for European funds being effective. For example, Edelbein in 2006 described how trust, corruption, and bureaucratic quality underlies contractual incompleteness and inefficient market transactions. In this vein, Fazekas posits that public procurements constitute an important potential path for corruption, given the possibility of generating closed networks where allocating contracts. On the other hand, the actual development of governance indicators allow to study funds through this perspective, and therefore we may be able to suggest a few ideas in order to improve its use. As I said before, European Commission in the 7th report on economic, social and territorial cohesion highlights its relevance in order to foster economic growth. Several papers have also studied the relevance of the rule of law and governance efficiency for the better performance of a country. So we have studied data from the last 2 waves of funds, and that means a total of 940 programs in 28 countries, including United Kingdom, and that's 486 programs for the period 2007 to 2013, and 454 programs for the period from 2014 to 2020. We don't have include interregional programs, and in this figure you can see the percentage of funds received by each country, and Italy, Spain and France are the countries with more funds. Now, in these maps allow to compare amounts for the receiving countries in the last 2 waves. We can see that generally speaking, northern and eastern regions receive smaller amounts than those in the south. Also, we can observe changes between waves, such as France receiving more funds in the last wave, or Netherlands receiving less. And here we have the percentage by funds, where the fund with the highest amount allocated is the Regional Development Fund. So we first analyze this data with visual tools like these ones, and showing differences between funds and countries through maps. And in a second step, we go through regression analysis. Now, regarding variables, European Commission uses 3 different amounts, which are the planned amount, the decided, and the spent amounts. From them, we define the 3 ratios that constitute our dependent variables. And the first one is the allocation ratio, that is the decided amount over the planned. The second one is the execution ratio, defined as the spent over decided amounts. And the third one is the performance ratio, which is the spent over planned amount. We propose the first one. The allocation ratio, as a measure for the effective use of funds in public institutions, as these are intended to manage funds in this first stage. And then the second and third ratios measure the effectiveness in a private level, as the organizations are those which finally spend the funds. So as independent variables, we have analyzed the size of the project through the logarithm of the total amount planned, that could indicate for an effective use of funds whether it is better for countries to manage large or small amounts. We also include measures for the economic situation, such as the inflation, the external debt, employment rates, and poverty, and for corruption, through Corruption Perceptions Index and Control of Corruption, and for governance, using variables as the ease of doing business, among others. We control also for a number of variables, such as the GDP and education. All right, then. The descriptive statistics show an appropriate distribution of all variables with an admissible standard deviation. And regarding dependent variables, the test of equality of means for the two waves supports significant differences for the execution and the performance ratios, while the allocation ratio has similar values for both periods. This is consistent with the possibility of regions spending funds until 2 years after the end of the programs, which will explain the lower mean for funds in the period ended in 2020. The conclusion is the same when we relate the allocation and the performance ratios as shown in these figures, where we can see a representation of the average of these values for each country. Now, this table compiles the average ratios by fund. We find that the agriculture fund has the highest execution and performance ratios, while its allocation ratio is not on the top. On the other hand, cohesion, regional development, and social funds, which have the greatest allocation ratios, do not have spent yet the 80% of that money. Finally, the Maritime and Fisheries Fund has the lowest ratios. Now, these maps show the allocation ratio by country for the two waves. While Ireland would be an example for both periods of designing funds quickly, Bulgaria, for example, will be the opposite. And we can also see how Portugal, for example, has improved its public management of funds in contrast to Italy, for example. And here, similarly, we can observe the distribution for the performance ratio. And while Spain is an example for spending as late as possible, Ireland again will be the fastest, the quickest in both waves. So preliminary results of regressions show a positive and significant relationship between funds size and the allocation ratio, suggesting the convenience of countries managing big projects. This effect is consistent regarding the performance ratio, although we observe weaker results. Positive and significant results for corruption measures suggest a consistent positive influence of transparency policies and a negative impact of corruption in the use of funds. Thus, regulatory frameworks fostering disclosure should lead to a better use of the funds. Regarding economic situation, the negative influence of GDP per capita and the positive one for the external debt suggest a more effective use of funds in countries less economically developed. However, this result does not stand when using the performance ratio, so it could be understood perhaps that public institutions of these countries do manage better, but private companies do not. And this statement would be consistent with the negative relationship obtained for the ease of doing business, as the easier starting private business, the worse use of funds. Results for education and financial stability do not seem significant. So to sum up, I will highlight the following 2 points. The first one is the relevance of the analysis, well, the European funds mean an enormous amount of money that could be quite helpful for the development of each country, and consequently, any effort supporting its effectiveness will greatly benefit the entire country. And the second conclusion, governance concerns are very current issues, and the European funds are not an exception. And likewise, corruption identification and removal are also should be a priority in the management of European funds. Final results may shed light in order to strengthen and facilitate a better use of the funds, contributing with suggestions for requirements that the European Commission may demand to the receiving countries. And that's all. Thank you very much, and every comment will be highly welcome.
I'm Ivan Pastor, PhD by the University of Valladolid, especially in economics and finance, and well, very motivated by the use of innovative approaches, no, such as neural networks, or I mean, artificial intelligence, or big data in general, no. So in this presentation, I want to present you two innovative methods for predicting fraud and corruption risks, especially in public procurements. No? And these initiatives have been only possible thanks to you, Oscar, David, Andrea, Felix, and Elena, who also participate in these initiatives. No? So let me share my screen to show the presentation. Okay, let me, because I'm working with two monitors, and it's quite complex to have everything okay. Let me change. Okay. Okay. Give me just a second, please. Okay. Okay. Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. Okay, so in this presentation, we will address the two following initiatives. First, we will show a neural network approach to detect potential corrupt practices according to the award criteria selected. And then we will finish showing an interactive dashboard of European public procurements. So let's start with our first point of the agenda. Public procurement is the process of purchasing goods, services, or works by the public sector from the private sector. Public procurement represents a substantial share of the world trade. For example, and for some countries such as Germany, France, or Finland, public procurements represent more than the 15% of their gross domestic product. But at the same time, public procurement is also considered as a potential source of corruption. And it is not hard to find news about this topic around the world. And we can see here some recent examples. No? The COVID pandemic is also increasing the number of public contracts and agreements, which in some cases are granted in a very quick way as an urgent action, no? Which could be used to trigger corrupt practices, no? or to hide them. So let's see if in the coming months or years, let's see if new cases are uncovered because of also the pandemic. No? In the following slide, we see a typical example of a public procurement process. In the first stages, public authorities detect a need, define the characteristics of the contract, and also the criteria which will be considered to award the tender. Once the notice is published, companies will offer their conditions, and only one will be selected and awarded. And corruption may appear at any of the stages along the procurement cycle. And in this first initiative, we will focus on the selection of the award criteria, which can be prone to corrupt practices. Let me explain this in detail. Tenders can be assessed using two evaluation methods. One is the price of the cost criteria only, and it means that the lower received offer will be awarded. So the lowest price criterion is quite objective and quite simple, but in some cases, some companies offer very low prices, and once the contract is awarded, they try to renegotiate several times the contract without any publicity and restricting the competition. The other method is the so-called most economically advantageous tender, or MIT. This option is the best option for the European Union because using this option, several aspects are taken into account. And here we can find an example in this slide. No? It is requested a bus service during at least 5 years, and some criteria are defined to assign which will be the winner company. No? The price, the experience, and for example, the response times. No? As we can also see, each criterion has assigned a weight or importance to be considered in the final award decision. Nevertheless, the MIT criteria also displayed some shortcomings because it is possible to introduce some qualitative factors, adding some kind of subjectivity to the assessment process. They could be intentionally fixed to increase the discretionary power in the final decision. As we think that it is an interesting field to be studied, we launched this initiative, which consists of the development of a practical tool to answer the following question. Is it possible to detect a list of criteria that could restrict competition? So our idea is to group all the different criteria we observed in previous tenders into different clusters, and then to assess if the number of received offers is significantly lower in some of them. And for that, we have extracted more than 70,000 awarded tenders for 33 different countries. And the data we use in this initiative comes from the European Tenders Electronic Daily Portal from January 2016 to December 2018. And we will also want to have the number of received offers for each tender as a proxy of the restriction of competition. Because according to previous studies, if the number of bidders in public procurement is too low, normally lower than 3 companies, there is a high risk of some restrictions in the level of competition. Many of the criteria we found are very similar, or there are even synonyms. So grouping them is not a very easy task, no? It is required a complex data cleansing process, and all the criteria should be translated, in this case, to the same language. No? In this case, is English. So in our data, to give you an idea, we've found more than 1,000 different criteria in the data set. So for grouping them, we need to use a technique named latent Dirichlet allocation, or LDA. Latent Dirichlet allocation can be considered as a natural language processing technique. And we want to apply LDA to classify each public procurement in different levels according to their list of awarded criteria. And let's explain how LDA works with an example. Let's imagine that we have a set of 3 tenders which have different selection criteria. For example, the first tender here on the left has only one selection criteria, the price. But on the other hand, we have a second tender, which will be awarded considering maintenance and service. And finally, we have a third tender on the right, which consider the experience and the price. For instance, if we assign labels manually, we could classify the first tender to topic 1 because it is based only on one criterion. In the case of the second tender, as it's different, it can be labeled, for example, as topic 2. And finally, we could classify the third tender as a mix of topics. For example, 70% of topic 1 and 30% to topic 2. Maybe the process could be considered as very easy because we have only 3 tenders, but it is not feasible for our data set of public procurements. Therefore, with LDA, we want to make this process in a more automatic way. LDA will consider each tender as a probabilistic distribution of different topics, and each topic will be at the same time characterized by a probabilistic distribution of words. So the goal of the LDA is to learn the topic mix in each tender and the word mix in each topic. So as I understand, it's quite difficult to understand in this way. We have included here a kind of summary of how an LDA model is trained. So we first have to choose the number of topics we think there are in our corpus. In this first example, we have selected only 2 topics. Then the LDA algorithm is going to look at all the criteria in our list of tenders. So here we have only 4, and it's going to randomly assign each word in only one of the 2 topics. So for example, on the top left there, we have our first tender, and let's say the word maintenance is going to be randomly assigned to topic 1. Now we know that this is incorrect, but this is just the first random assignment. Then LDA is going to calculate how often is this topic in the first tender and how the word, this word maintenance is present or occurs in the topics overall. So based on those 2 things, LDA will change the topic assignments for this word because the maintenance criteria doesn't occur much in topic 1. So in the next iteration, the maintenance criteria is likely to be assigned to topic 2. LDA is an iterative approach that is done word by word and by topic until the algorithm converges, or when eventually the topics will start to make sense. So it is an intensive and very time-consuming procedure. Also, to avoid subjectivity from our part, for example, determining the number of topics in the model, some measures are commonly used to determine if the number of topics is also well selected. Well, we have applied this technique to our dataset of tenders, and we found that the optimal number of topics is 4. So each tender can be already classified to a probability distribution of topics as shown in this table. For example, the first tender, which has 2 different criteria, belongs in an 80% to topic 1, a 12% to topic 2, and so on. At the same time, each topic is defined as a vector of words and weights. So the higher the weight, the most important is this word in this topic. As a result, we have obtained that topic 1 assigns high importance to technical or quality criteria, while, for example, topic 3 is mainly characterized by the price criterion. So at this point, we could classify each tender under the most dominant topic, which means to the topic with the highest probability. So in the case of our first tender here, the most dominant topic is topic 1. Therefore, we will have only 4 different groups of tenders. This is the main idea of this approach. In the following slide, we just display the average of tenders where the number of received offer is lower than 3 by each group. And it is shown we obtain interesting results as we see significant statistical differences among the different topics. According to this slide, for example, the 51% of tender classified under the topic 3 has received less than 3 tenders. To be classified under this topic, topic number 3, means that the most common criteria are related mainly to the cost and the price. So therefore, these results are quite aligned with the European expectations that believing that the MID criteria as less prone to present problems limiting the competition. No? We could have ended up here. Nevertheless, we observe some shortcomings in this approach because we are not considering the total distribution of topics losing some important information. It means that there could be a combination of topics resulting in a better differentiation among the different groups. So to take into consideration the whole distribution of topics, we will train a final model, and this time is an unsupervised neural network called self-organizing maps, or SOM, is the acronym. No? SOM are a kind of artificial neural network which represent an alternative to classical clustering methods because it deals properly with noise and nonlinear relations in the data. And it transforms multivariate data into bidimensional information. No? This figure on gray represents the classical view of SOM. And the idea to consider this approach as a neural network is because SOM tries to simulate how our brain captures information and classify it in different regions and neurons, even ignoring the meaning of the information, the underlying information. No? For example, when we are child, no, we don't know about what is the name of the different animals, for example, no, but our brain is able to detect the patterns in the data of the different animals and to classify them in different clusters automatically. No, we see, for example, important differences between, I don't know, an eagle and a tiger, for example. No, and our brain is able to identify these patterns and to separate perfectly in our mind. No. So this approach, the self-organizing maps, tries to make the same thing, but in this case with our data of public procurement. No, the idea is I don't know what kind of information are you providing to me, the algorithm, but I'm able to organize for you and establish in the different parts and in a bidimensional map. Only for you, no? This is the idea. So once the model is trained, we obtain our final bidimensional map, and it is possible to show the distribution of the input variables in the map. So in our case, the distribution of our 4 topics individually. So light colors in these 4 maps here indicate that attender classified in the part of the map will display low values of this variable, while dark ones indicate high values. So we can see how the map classifies the procurements with the highest values of specific topics into the corners of the map. For example, public procurement contracts with high probabilities to belong to topic 1 will be placed in the top right part of the map. So in the same way, tenders which or having very similar topic distribution will be placed in the middle part of the training map. In this map, the problem is that we don't have now defined groups. So finally, we will apply hierarchical clustering on the map to delimitate these groups in a more appropriate way than using the most dominant topic. This is the underlying idea here. No? So the resulting map with the associated groups can be found in the bottom left part of this slide. Although this technique is unsupervised, we decide to split the data into 2 parts to carry out this process, and therefore verify if the approach performs well on non-observed data. So specifically, we split the use of the awarded tenders in 2018 as test data. So we don't use this information this year to train the model, just to validate it. The results we obtain show that, sorry, is just the previous slide. The results we obtained show that groups were statistically different in both samples. So our model can identify which standards display more discretional criteria and which are more prone to receive a low number of offers. Again, the results are quite aligned with the expectations of the European Union in the sense that they provide high importance to the price criteria to reduce the competition. So this model, we know, is complex, but it could be very useful to detect which criteria could trigger problems, limiting or restricting the competition, adding some kind of subjectivity and increasing the discretionary power in the final decision. So, well, this is the first initiative we want to share with you. So now we can move to the following initiative. No? The following initiative is the visualizing corruption risks in Europe. Well, when we treat corruption, usually the main problem we face is how to find real data with evidence, with real cases, no, or evidence of corruption. Other times, the problem we should face is just the opposite. No? The amount of information is so large that we need ways to summarize the data in some way. No? Well, so the goal is of this second initiative is just that, no? Is to develop a creative and interactive tool to summarize the data available about public procurements, and with that, to find patterns or signal of corruption. When no cases of corruption are available, it is very common the use of red flags indicators, which represent signals or potential corruption. For example, in the previous initiative, we used the number of receiver offers. No? If we obtain lower than 3, this is a red flag indicator, no? A bad signal, if I can say. Red flags indicators represent signals of potential corruption. A single red flag indicator in a public procurement does not indicate corruption itself, no? But the more red flags we have, the higher the chance of corruption. What we try to do with this initiative is to collect different red flags already tested in the literature and create a dashboard to visualize them dynamically. No? The initiative is a website called crystaltender.com. You have this, and it contains information on public procurements to more than 30 different countries. This website collects the last 5 years of information on European tenders. This dashboard provides information related to the total amount of public procurements, the detailed list of awarded companies by country, details about the different procedures and the evolution of tenders over time. So a lot of information in a very summarized way, if I can say. Furthermore, it also contains a section where countries and public authorities' behavior is assessed. So the most common red flags are identified by country and buyer name. And in this slide, we have included a concrete example. Specifically, we focus in German tenders. Granted in 2020. According to the dashboard on the website, the buyer with the highest number of red flags in this year is the Federal Office of Equipment, Information Technology and Utilization. Additionally, our tool shows that a total of 211 contracts has been awarded by this public authority. And we can also obtain the average number of red flags by awarded procurement. So following the example, the average number of red flags for this tender is almost 5. So it's quite interesting because with this information, we can it is possible to make a kind of rank ordering of the different public authorities, assigning public procurements, no? So I don't know, if we observe one specific public authority with all the awarded contracts display about, I don't know, 15 different red flags, maybe there is something to look into this public authority, or maybe it's a way to analyze in deep what is happening, no? In fact, I remember that a red flag is not a signal of corruption itself, but yes, it's a kind of signal, no? So we believe that this kind of tool is very useful to this purpose, no? And finally, it's better to see in action this website, no? And to do that, we have included this kind of video, a kind of demo, trying to access to the website we created and how it works, no? So let me show you. Oh. Okay. So it is a demo, but it is real. You go to the page. This is the, well, it's not very pretty, this first slide, but this is the important one, no? You can select different years. For example, here we are selecting 2020. I don't know, we can see different information, the number of awarded tenders by company. We can, in an easy way, to filter the information by a specific country. For example, here, Germany, when we observe the number of awarded tenders by company, we can, this is the, in this case, I put in pause, no? We are seeing all the tenders, German tenders, but as you can see here, the resident country of the awarded companies is different, no? They can come from Spain, from France, from companies placed in Poland, no? This is also relevant information, no? If I can say. We can see also the different procedures type, if the procedure type is open, public procurements, how much negotiated with publicity, restricted. In my opinion, is a powerful tool. No, this is in fact is created by Power BI. So we are filtering in real case, I don't know, close to 1 million of different observations, and Power BI is able to filter the data in just a second. No, for me, is quite powerful. So let's start again the video. So if we move to the following slide, this is the last slide I mentioned. We can filter by the different year, the specific country you want to see. For example, Germany, to be coherent with the presentation. And then we have a lot of information about the buyer name, the average sum or red flags, the number of tenders awarded by this public authority. And just below, for me, is quite relevant. You can see also the most relevant red flags used in the literature applied on each specific contract awarded by the different public authorities. So we can see, for example, the first one here. Well, I don't speak German, so I don't understand this name, no? But the Van de Sant buyer name, from 211 tenders they award, close to 200 of them only receive one offer. No, this is relevant. No, maybe again, no, it's not a corruption signal. No, it's just an indicator. No, maybe they are offering a specific contract. So detailed contract, which is very difficult to other companies to stay in the process, no, because it's quite specific, or just only one company is able to provide this service. No, it's almost possible, but well, it's useful information to public authorities, no, to review if something strange is happening with a specific public authority. And well, in summary, is the two initiatives we want to present for this training session, no, is that. So many thanks for your attendance.